So hello, everyone, and welcome to our Trust, Ethics and Governance Alliance seminar. We're very fortunate to have Oliver Schilke join us today to share one of his recent papers with us. I'd like to start by first acknowledging the traditional owners and the custodians on the many lands on which we're meeting today, conscious we're joining from all different parts of Australia as well as overseas. So on behalf of UQ, and I want to pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country, and we recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. So if this is your first time joining us, our TIGA seminar series aims to develop a deeper understanding of trust, ethics and governance by sharing the latest research insights as well as other evidence-based insights. It's also a vehicle to facilitate research connections and collaborations as well. If you'd like to learn more about TIGA, I do encourage you to check out our website and our LinkedIn page, which provide an overview of our latest research as well as our events and news. So a very warm welcome to our presenter, Oliver Schilke. Oliver is an associate professor at the University of Arizona and is director of the Center for Trust Studies. So one of the very few centers at an international level that focuses specifically on research around trust. So Oliver completed his PhD in sociology at the University of California, and his research interests are focused around three key pillars. So at a theoretical level, he studies micro-institutional processes such as trust, routines, and legitimacy. And I've read a lot of Oliver's work. It's fantastic, as well as his reviews of particularly the sociological research on trust. I can highly recommend it. And also at a substantive level, Oliver's research addresses interorganizational relationships, as well as R&D and entrepreneurship. And at a methodological level, he uses experiments, surveys, and large archival data sets to do most of his empirical work. So the title of Oliver's paper today is The Power to Reward versus the Power to Punish. And if my understanding is correct, Oliver's paper is going to explore how supervisors use valued resources to reward or punish their followers, and how this influences both perceptions of supervisor trustworthiness, but also the extent to which employees pursue new opportunities and experiment with new ways of working. We also have one of Oliver's co-authors on this paper, John Evans, in the audience with us today. So welcome, John. And I hear that you'll also be available to perhaps take some of the questions later on. So a bit of housekeeping. Oliver will present for somewhere between 30 and 40 minutes. We'll then open it up for Q&A. Oliver is, though, happy to also take questions as he goes through and encourages that. So if you have any questions, just raise your hand online and we'll come to you and hand the microphone over to you. If you're not speaking, though, if you could please mute your microphone just to make sure we don't have any interference. And yeah, at the end, we'll have a good sort of 15 minutes or so to have some nice Q&A. Also, feel free to pose any questions that come to you in the chat function, and we can either handle those as we're going through the seminar or at the end in Q&A as well. Okay, without further ado, I'd love to hand over to you, Oliver.
Thank you very much, Nicole, for the generous introduction and for having me today give a talk. Thank you also to Shannon for organizing this session and preparing everything so wonderfully. I'm very excited to be here and see familiar faces, but also new faces in the audience. Very nice to meet you all. And I'm looking forward to your questions. As Nicole mentioned, please feel free to ask the question throughout the talk. I'm more interested in having an interactive, engaging discussion than just to defer everything till the end. Okay, so Nicole mentioned the title of the talk, but before we get there, right, the Americans, they need to add a little plug right at the beginning and advertising. And for myself, Nicole also mentioned it, but I wanted to direct your attention. If you're interested in this kind of research, you might also be interested in what the center is doing at the University of Arizona. We facilitate a lot of research and also do a speaker series, so check that out. Here you'll see some past talks also posted, and it's my pleasure to also announce a talk that Nicole will be giving in my speaker series. So that's happening on October 24th, and you can register for that right now. Here's a little bit more detail on the talk. It's still way out, so still plenty of time to register and put it on the calendar. Very excited to see Nicole give a talk later this year. Other things you might find useful, there's a newsletter where I keep you up to date, not too frequently, and you can always opt out on things surrounding trust, and you will find the recordings of past talks that I've hosted on the website as well. Last announcement, I'm currently co-organizing a special issue that is accepting submissions. Well, pretty soon. I think the submission window opens in May. The deadline is June 30th, and it's, of course, surrounding trust, especially in uncertain times. We're particularly interested in the role of institutions and generally the interplay between trust and uncertainty. So if that's your research interest, definitely consider a submission. That's it with the advertising. We can finally get to the content of the talk. And as Nicole mentioned, this paper is co-authored, and actually the first author on it is John Evans, who's a previous PhD student in my department. John, do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. John Evans, I'm an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia. As Oliver mentioned, my PhD I completed at Arizona, and Oliver was one of my advisors. So I'm excited to have this presented. I believe this is the first time we presented this work to anybody. So I'm excited to hear your feedback and thoughts on this, and thank you for letting me be here.
Yeah. Thanks, John. I think you're right. It's unusual that we've not presented this paper before. Okay, so as John mentioned, I think this is the first time I'm presenting this paper today, which is weird because it just got accepted for publication at Organization Science. A couple of weeks ago, it got published online as a forthcoming article, which of course we're very excited about. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start the talk with sharing with you what the main findings are. So if you'd rather want to hold the suspense, keep your ears shut for a little while. So here are the key insights from this talk. What we're going to do in this paper, we introduce the notion of power framing as an important component of leader-follower relationships. And what we argue and show is that it shapes key organizational processes, particularly trust and exploration, which are our focal outcomes here. And we show that it's specifically reward rather than punishment power framing that increases perceptions of benevolence of a leader, and in turn fosters employee exploration behavior. So that's kind of the roadmap of this paper, so you know where I'm going with this. And this story fits into this broader research program where a lot of my papers fit in these days, which is about micro-foundations. I'm sure you might have heard of it. It's the idea that, macro-level phenomena have, of course, effects on macro-level outcomes, but these effects are to a large extent mediated by the micro-foundations. That is the effect that macro-level effects such as institutions have on the conditions for individual action, and in turn that individual action, which ultimately informs social outcomes. So a bit more specifically and applied to this paper here, you could think of organizational power institutions as a macro level fact that individuals face. In turn, this influences their trust in their counterparts, and their trust in their counterparts in turn informs individuals' exploration, which ultimately produces or informs organizational innovation. So, but before we get ahead of ourselves, let's start from the beginning and kind of develop what this paper is about. This overall notion of exploration versus exploitation goes back to Jim March, who's made it very famous. Exploration is thought of as something like search, variation, risk-taking, and experimentation, these kind of things. On the other hand, we have exploitation, which is more about refinement and choice, production, efficiency, selection, and execution. Of course, organizations would benefit from having both. But the thing is, exploration is often considered very risky and long-termy, whereas exploitation is more familiar and comfortable for many decision makers, which is why there's this inherent tendency to prioritize exploitation over exploration. It's just easier and more comfortable to do what you're already used to than to venture out and explore new ideas. However, as I said, organizations would benefit from having a certain degree of both, and thus especially kind of nudge people into exploration. So what could be done to induce targeted exploration, and specifically what can be done to get each and every member of the organization, each employee on board and deliberately and independently explore new opportunities on behalf of the organization? That's the broader research question that we are addressing here. And to give you an idea on what recent papers found or looked at in terms of how individual level exploration can be improved, I want to highlight 3 papers that are kind of influential. They all adopt a very networky orientation in that the network of individuals matter a lot in terms of the degree to which they would explore. For example, Rogan and Moore show that things like network density, contact heterogeneity, network informality are drivers of exploration behavior. In a follow-up study 3 years later, they also show that it's specifically networks that are built and developed based on people's personal resources rather than firm resources that help foster exploration. And finally, a study by Kuhn and Cease shows that the level of the hierarchy in the organizational structure can really inhibit exploration in certain ways, but also foster it in others. So level of hierarchy in org structure is another antecedent to employees' tendency to explore new options. Now, as you can see, all of these 3 studies have a very structural approach in that they emphasize structural configurations and how they, in turn, affect exploration activities. They don't really go deeper and look into what's happening within those ties, the nature and relation characteristics of the ties that individuals are embedded in. Now, these structural configurations, as we argue, they can explain probably really well if people have the right resources to explore, but they're not sufficient to really understand the motivation to enact and use those resources for exploration activities. This is where we argue a more relational account can come in handy to figure out what drives people's motivations to explore. So our research approach, as you would have imagined, is to dive in on those relational characteristics as drivers of exploration, which then leads to 2 questions. First is which relation, right? When we talk about relation characteristics, what do we mean by relations? And we focus here specifically on the relationship between the employees and their superior, because that's a very important one, of course, in organizational settings. So we look at manager-employee relationships, and then the second question is which characteristics. In this paper, as the title implied, we're specifically going to look at power and trust as arguably 2 of the most important relational characteristics in social settings. So what is power? Broadly defined, it can be understood as the extent to which one party, in this context, the superior, in a relationship has control over resources valued by the other party, in this context, the employee. Now, the term resources can mean different things. It can be a resource to reward, to provide valued and desirable things, but it can also be resources to punish, to take away desirable things or assign things that are less desirable. And this implies that there are 2 ways to think of power. It can either be a reward power, again, providing things that are desirable, or punishment power, providing things that are undesirable to those lower in power. So distinguishing between these 2 aspects of power, we think it makes a lot of sense because prior research has shown, or argued at least, that reward and punishment can have really different effects. So not all power is the same. And also, it's kind of interesting to see that there's a lot of discretion that managers have in terms of how to frame their power. They can really describe the same situation, the same incentives in terms of reward or in terms of punishment. So there's a significant discretion on that. Here's one example. So a manager could emphasize that an employee's good performance will result in receiving desirable work assignment, or the same manager could also say that bad performance will result in not receiving those desirable work assignments. So it's essentially the outcome of what's really happening is equivalent. It's really primarily about the framing of power as either reward or punishment oriented. Okay, that's my terminology around power. Now we come to trust. One of the most widely used definition of trust that we also follow here in this paper is a party's willingness to make themselves vulnerable to the actions of another party. So vulnerability is a key part of that definition. And what is that willingness based on? It's based on a perception that the other party is probably going to be trustworthy. So I can make myself vulnerable because the other party is likely not going to screw me or behave in an untrustworthy way. And trustworthiness has been commonly conceptualized based on 3 dimensions, right? There's the so-called ABI model by Mayer et al. Trustworthiness can either be based on perceptions of ability, that somebody's very competent, benevolence, that somebody's going to take my interest to heart, or integrity, that that person will adhere to principles that I find acceptable. So these are 3 different dimensions in this research, and you will see in a little bit why we focus on benevolence as, again, in our context, the most relevant dimension of trustworthiness. And again, the formal definition of the extent to which a trustee is believed to want to do good to the truster. Okay, so that wraps up the terminology. Let's look at some hypotheses. We have a total of 3. I'm going to provide details about the first 2 and only mention the third in passing. So we have enough time for the empirical part and your questions. So this is really the main effect hypothesis. The main assumption or the main proposition we are making here is that it is reward power framing rather than punishment power framing that can really foster employees' exploration. And to develop that baseline proposition, we build on regulatory focus theory. This theory argues that the individuals have 2 key goals as they engage in organizational tasks and social relationships more generally. So one is to avoid pain, and the other is to approach pleasure. So looking at the avoiding pain part of things, if people are in that mindset that they want to avoid pain, that directs their focus very much on potential negative outcomes. So they're very focused on what could go wrong. If they have that mindset, they're more interested in stability and minimizing mistakes than anything else. They're not interested in any upside potential. They're primarily interested in avoiding downside problems. However, if they're in an approaching pleasure mindset, this directs their attention on the possibility that there could be possible positive outcomes. Nice things could happen, right? So if that's their primary mode of thinking, they might be more willing to take on risks because their focus is more on the upside risk than on the downside risk, which makes them more willing to take those risks. Now, if you think about this line of argument from regulatory focus theory, the first argument is very much consistent with a punishment power framing, creating this mindset of pain and positive and potential negative outcomes, a tendency to prefer stability, and thus focus on exploitation activity. However, if the counterpart uses a reward power framing, I'm far more likely to think about, there could be possible positive outcomes, and this makes me more willing to take on risks, and thus I'm more willing to explore. So based on regulatory focus theory, we have this main effect hypothesis of reward power framing supporting employee exploration rather than exploitation. Now, why is that really? What's going on in that relationship when the superior uses one or the other type of power framing? This is what the second hypothesis is about, where we bring in a mediator that has to do with the perceived trustworthiness as a result of power framing. So here we propose that it is the perceived benevolence of the superior that mediates the positive effect of that reward power framing on employee exploration. And our argument goes somewhat as follows. We argue that reward power framing is viewed as a signal to want do good to employees. So a superior who uses power framing is perceived as a good guy, essentially, somebody who doesn't want to harm me. And if that is true, I might think that this manager who rewards positive performance is really a benevolent person. He or she will not screw me. He will take my interests to heart. However, if a superior uses punishment power framing, that is likely to weigh heavily on my perceptions of that superior and my whole attitude towards work. So managers who punish bad performance might be perceived as low in benevolence or even malevolent. Okay, so if reward power framing improves perception of benevolence, this might signal that there is quite a bit of support for creative work in my work environment and by my superior. If that's true, if I feel supported, I'm far more likely to explore and take those risks to pursue new opportunities. However, if I perceive a threat from the punishment power framing, I'm more likely to be in this exploitation mindset and pursue these kind of behaviors. So this leads us again to this mediation pathway from power framing to perceptions of benevolence to exploitation or exploration versus exploitation. Finally, we have a moderation hypothesis, which is about the employee's power distance orientation as a stable trait. Power distance orientation is frequently used as a cultural variable, but there's also quite a bit of intracultural variation across individuals. So it can also be thought of more as a personality trait, independent of national culture. So what we are saying here basically is that this whole effect that we proposed previously, the effect of reward power framing on employee exploration, that this will be much more intense and pronounced when the employee is high in power distance orientation rather than low. And as I mentioned, I'm only going to go through this quickly. The general notion is that if I'm low in power distance orientation, if I don't even believe in power differences being important, I might not even care about my perceptions and the characteristics of my superior. They're less important in informing my behavior. The leader overall is perceived as less influential in what I do at work. Whereas if I'm high in power distance orientation, I'm more likely to pay really attention closely to who the leader is and whether this person is trustworthy, especially. So the leader's trustworthiness perceptions are particularly influential in shaping employees' behavior when these employees are high in power distance orientation. Okay, so with that, I'm going to move on to the empirical work. Since I haven't seen any questions in the chat and haven't heard from you in a while, can I check in real quick if the internet is even still working? Can you give me a sign that that you can still hear me and I'm not just
It's all
talking?
good, Oliver. It's coming through very, very clearly. Thank you.
Thank you.
We all turned off our videos just to keep the stable internet.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just checking. Cool. So with that, of course, if you have questions about these hypotheses, please shoot now. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to how we tested this stuff. So in order to test these three hypotheses, we conducted two studies. The first is an experiment. So a lab experiment, which we conducted online, but it's a very controlled setting where we have a behavioral task and manipulate power through manipulation. So exploration is then captured through behavior of the participants in the experiment. The second study is a field survey. Here we conducted a survey among a large sample of employees, and we measured these three variables. So we also extended the study to look at hypothesis 3 only in study 2, and we measured all three variables via self-reports, but at 2 points in time. I'm going to talk more about the design in a little bit. So the idea here is to have one study, the experiment that's high in interlegibility. It can really drive home causality. And the other one that's more of a field setting, it introduces ecological validity to show that all this stuff is actually happening in field setting as well. Okay, so both studies, we follow state-of-the-art guidelines for transparency in research. We posted everything on OSF, pre-registered everything there, the data you'll find there, and all the materials, surveys, the Qualtrics task, including the behavioral backend and all that is on OSF. So we make it as easy as possible to replicate our studies. Study one, again, the experimental task. We build on a prior task introduced by Ederer and Manso in Management Science 2013. In this task, the participant is tasked to be the manager of a lemonade stand, right? That's kind of a cool task because everybody kind of knows what a lemonade stand is and what it does, but it's not too complex of a business to run. Specifically, they need to make five decisions here. And there are 10 consecutive decision rounds. They receive feedback after each round, after putting in their decisions. There are actual good and bad decisions to make. So they receive customer feedback to steer them in different directions. And again, they make 5 decisions about the location of the stand, where do they want to put that stand, about the color of the lemonade. Is it yellow or pink, I believe? The price, of course, cheap, expensive. They can decide about how much sugar to put into the lemonade and how much lemon to put into the lemonade. So these are the 5 decision parameters that they need to figure out in across 10 decision rounds. At the beginning of the task, they get a letter from the predecessor, previous person running the lemonade stand. And in that letter, the predecessor shared were their configurations for these 5 decisions. So it allows us to kind of measure exploration in several ways. So we look at first, how much do they deviate from the letter, from their predecessor in the first round? And then we also measure in the rounds thereafter, how much do they really try out different combinations of things versus stay with what they started out with or only made minor tweaks. So we measure exploration again as a behavioral variable, thought of as pursuing new knowledge by exploring alternative location and lemonade colors and making changes in sugar content, lemon content, and price over those 10 decision rounds. And then we produce this composite index that is kind of an aggregation of all these different things. And it's approximately normally distributed and ranges from 0 to 40. Okay, that's the DV. And for the IOE, the experimental manipulation, we are introducing a boss through a video, and you can see it. It's my co-author, John Evans. He recorded a video where he introduces himself as the experimenter who will later evaluate the participants, the performance of those participants, and then also, depending on the condition, either reward them or punish them. And here are a little bit more detail in the punishment power condition. We talk about how, based on their performance, some participants will actually be punished. They will have to complete a second task. So the possibility of having to spend additional time that participants did not see coming is viewed as the punishment. In the reward power condition, we flip that. In that condition, people already kind of thought as a baseline, as a default, they would have to engage in 2 tasks. And here the reward is, if they're performing well on the lemonade stand, they wouldn't have to participate in the second task, a very arduous text analysis task that nobody wants to be part of because it's very annoying. We picked it to be a particularly annoying task. So here again, the reward is, if you're performing well on the lemonade stand task, then you don't have to go and participate in that second task as well. And the cool thing is that we did not use deception for any of that. So we actually measure performance on the task of the lemonade thing. And this, like half of the participants were high performers, and the other half approximately were classified as low performers. And then the low performers, unfortunately, also had to do the text analysis task for another 15 minutes, and the high performance did not. So again, in terms of the actual outcome, there's no difference between the two conditions, right? It's just the framing of whether they would have to do the task that they did not anticipate as a punishment, or the task would be taken away as a reward for good performance. Okay, the mediated benevolence, we used the standard measure introduced by Mayer and Davis, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 item measure, to measure the benevolence, the perceived benevolence of the experimenter John in the task. Okay, so we had a total of 422 individuals participate in this study. We recruited them through Prolific and paid them $3.50. So on average, they were about 33 years old, a few more males than females, and we used the between subjects design, single factor. That means that participants, like approximately half of the 422, were assigned to the reward power condition, and the other half were randomly assigned to the punishment power condition. And here are some results. So let's start by looking at the main effect, just the difference in terms of exploration. The composite index, again, ranging from 0 to 40, normally distributed. We see that there is significantly more exploration going on in the reward power condition than in the punishment power condition. And again, this significant, the difference is statistically significant at the 1% level. We then looked at the mediation model to test the second hypothesis about benevolence being a mediator, and we couldn't stop and be curious about whether other trustworthiness dimensions might also play a role. I mean, we had zero reason to believe ability would play a role here, that perceptions of ability would change depending on power framing, but there was reason to believe that integrity might also be something that might be considered a consequence of power framing, and that those adopting a reward power framing would be seen as having higher integrity. And that's also what we find. What we also find is that in the second stage, perceptions of integrity do very little to nothing in shaping employees' behavior in terms of exploration. However, benevolent also has a significant effect in that second stage. So the more benevolent the leader, John, was and perceived, the more the participants would engage in exploration in the task. And in support of the mediation effect, we also find a significant indirect effect from power framing through benevolence on exploration. The other indirect effect through integrity was not significant. But again, just to clarify, there's no confusion. We only included integrity for exploratory purposes. We only pre-registered benevolence and hypothesized about that. Integrity was just for fun, more or less. Okay, moving on to the second study. Again, this is the field survey. Here we went to Qualtrics online panels, which is kind of neat because it allows you to be more targeted in what kind of people you want. On the other hand, it's way more expensive. So that's the downside. It is significantly more expensive than Prolific or mTurk. But again, we were able to tell them, you know, we only want real organizational decision makers with certain decision-making powers in organizations who have a full-time job and are also assigned to one primary supervisor. Of course, we wanted to ask them about that supervisor, obviously. And in that survey, we have more senior participants, on average a little more than 50 years old, primarily male. And these participants, we split it up into 2 consecutive surveys with a 1-week lag in between. This is primarily to improve a little bit the causal inference capability, but primarily to avoid common method bias. So we collected independent variables and the moderator and control variables in the first survey, and then moved on to the mediator and the DV in the second survey. Okay, so here in terms of the measures, the dependent variable, we only measured as a perception, not as a behavior, because it's a survey, not an experiment. So we used an established scale, which showed decent reliability. An example item here is searching for new possibilities with respect to products and services, processes, or markets. The independent variable here is reward versus punishment power. We developed new scales for that because we didn't find any in existing literature. We already used them in the first study as manipulation checks. And we had also run a separate pilot study to validate those scales and run confirmatory factor analysis and all that. So we'd done that previously, but here we also show that these two scales, two separate scales, one for reward and the other for punishment power, they have decent reliability. So example for reward power, an item would be the manager has power to distribute rewards that are value. Punishment power, on the other hand, an example item would be the manager is in position to assign punishments. Then we have the mediator, again, benevolence. We use the same measure as in the survey, with an example item being my boss really looks out for what's important to me. And then the moderator is power distance orientation. We adopt an existing measure from you et al. People in higher positions should make most decisions without consulting. I need to move a little panel here, without consulting people in lower positions. We also included a bunch of controls, such as the frequency of interactions with the boss in a typical week, the tenure of assignment with the boss, how long they've been working together, the participants' job level, how far up in the hierarchy are they, and just the organizational environment in terms of dynamism. Okay, so some results here. First, a very simple OLS regression with our independent variable and the controls. Here we find that reward power framing has a significant positive effect on self-reported exploration in their work, so significant at the 1% level. Moving on to the more complicated moderated mediation model, we find first that there is an indirect effect in support of the second hypothesis of power framing on exploration that goes through benevolence. Like in the first study, we see that power framing leads to increased perceptions of benevolence. And in turn, there is a relationship between benevolence and exploration, and this indirect effect in total is positive and significant. We also introduced that moderator here, power distance orientation, which kicks in at the second stage. The interaction term itself is significant, and to see what's going on, I've plotted the interaction effect here. What we can see here is that among those low in power distance orientation, the solid line, we see very little of an effect of benevolence on exploration activity. The curve is pretty much flat, just a little bit of an effect. However, the effect becomes very steep and strong when we move to the subsample of high power distance orientation participants. Here we really see that benevolence matters. So people high in power distance orientation really care about whether or not their supervisor's benevolent. Okay, so to wrap up, here are the two main contributions. So we contribute primarily, of course, to research on the microfoundations of exploration. We add to the structural understanding that's already fairly established in that literature by introducing a relational perspective to predicting exploration behavior that's more about the relationship between employees and their boss. And we're adding process evidence and to understand what's really going on by looking at supervisor perceptions. Also, we think we make it a contribution to the broad literature on power. There's been a lot of stuff on the degree of power, low versus high, but there's relatively little on qualitative differences in terms of how power is being framed. We think there's a lot of potential to shed light on a whole lot of important organizational consequences that power framing, while holding constant the degree of power, can produce. Okay, with that, I'm happy to open it up for questions. Looking forward to any comments or clarification questions that you might have, or whatever you want to talk about.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Oliver. That was a great presentation, very, very clear, and some really, really interesting findings in there.